Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon, this Friday afternoon, for this webinar. My name is Tari Ronyimo, and I am a Deputy Divisional Director at Digital Frontiers Institute. Now, we know, for those of us who are familiar with Digital Frontiers Institute, it is the school within Digital Frontiers that delivers the programs. So my passions lie in inclusive finance and gender equality, and we've got two programs that really cover this, which is the Certified Digital Finance Practitioner Program, as well as the Gender Equality Changemaker Program. I'm so excited to have this webinar, which we've dubbed Women on Platforms, with the special focus on emerging markets. And really, this is a chance for us to learn more about digital platforms and their importance in the digital economy, and how that has impacted women's financial lives, which marries, and I'm sure that most of you here are passionate about the same subjects and are here to learn more. So thank you for that. I think that when we're talking about platforms, you know, we really want to see how that has affected the digital economy, and also how that then translates into financial inclusion, specifically women's financial inclusion. I think most of us are familiar with the bigger platforms like Jumia, Alibaba, and Amazon, and even the social platforms where maybe our vulnerable markets play, which is Facebook and WhatsApp. We know that in a study by Senfree, just to give an intro, just to really about this webinar, in 2018, Senfree counted about 277 active digital platforms across 8 African countries. Now, this really means that there are a lot of marketplaces in the emerging markets that we all come from, especially if you are a student or alumni students from Digital Frontiers Institute. Most of our market is in emerging markets, with most of our students coming from the sub-Saharan markets and Asian markets, such as Bangladesh and Pakistan. So the studies that CGAP has done really focus in the same markets that we all come from. So we should be able to have some good conversation there. Now, I don't want to steal the limelight from our guest speaker that we have here. It's Rani Despande, and I would like to just quickly introduce her. She can give some more information about herself if she wants, but this is the introduction that I have. Rani is an independent consultant with over 20 years experience supporting the provision of financial services for low-income and marginalized populations, especially women and youth. At CGAP, she works on financial services for platform workers with a focus on women, as well as a new initiative examining the role of financial inclusion in enhancing well-being outcomes for young women. Previously, she directed the Save the Children's 35 million portfolio of youth and off-farm livelihoods development work in over a dozen countries. From 2010 to 2016, she led the Youth Save, an initiative that assisted over 150,000 teens to open tailored savings accounts and save over 1.2 million. So I think we know that Rani has a lot of experience to share with us. So welcome, Rani.
Thank you so much, and I hope everyone can hear me clearly. Thanks for that generous introduction, an extensive introduction. I won't spend any more time on myself, but rather jump right into CGAP's work on platform workers, particularly women. So let me share my slides and you will let me know when you can see them properly.
We can see the slides running.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to share today is findings from a large-scale qualitative study we did with platform workers in early 2020. So this was sort of right in the middle of the sort of hard phase of the pandemic in the beginning. And I'm going to focus on two aspects of our findings. Excuse me. First, how we found that women participated in platform work. And second, how they use or would like to use financial services. We also asked a lot of questions about their subjective experiences of platform work, how they got into it, what they like, don't like, how it has impacted them economically. But I'm going to save that for later for the sake of time during this presentation, but I'm happy to address any related questions during the discussion. And I'd also encourage you to read the complete report at the CGAP site, and maybe Tarira, if you have it handy, you can drop that link in the chat. So consider this just a high-level taste of the research that we did. So before we get started, let's clarify what we meant in this context by platforms and platform workers. So we really focused in on this piece of research on those technology-enabled business models that focus on connecting buyers and sellers mainly of goods or services. They don't make the goods or services, they don't own the goods at any point, but they host markets. Conversely, platform workers undertake focused and time-bound activities, so they're more like tasks than jobs. And importantly, they operate outside of a traditional employer-employee relationship. That's critical. They can sell goods or products, goods or services. The services could be either blue collar or white collar. And the sellers of goods could range from, a one-person social commerce outfit to even large wholesale e-commerce outfits. And why are we working on platforms? Well, everybody on this call, I'm sure knows, the number of platforms has been growing at a rapid clip. Now, it still makes up a small proportion of the workforce in most developing countries, but it is growing rapidly. And so we're interested in the potential financial inclusion angle of this growth, specifically how the digital rails and digital trails laid down by the interaction of platforms and their workers could facilitate better, lower cost provision of financial services to this segment. But we're also interested in gender equitable financial inclusion. And so we need to look at whether women in these emerging types of work had a specifically gendered experience. And if so, how it differs from men's, especially with regard to their use or potential use of financial services. So what did we do? In partnership with Dahlberg Design, we conducted a qualitative study with over 400 platform workers, over 40% of whom were women. We did both in-depth interviews as well as a structured interview, so a survey, in 5 verticals: ride-hailing, delivery and logistics, personal and home services, e-lancing, and e-commerce, and 5 countries that you see on the map in front of you: Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, India, and Indonesia. So what did we find about women's participation in particular? Well, women, like men, learned about platform work in diverse ways, but maybe somewhat counterintuitively, more women in our survey got their information from the internet versus their social ties and networks, which were a relatively more important source for men. However, according to our interviews, the friends and colleagues around these women did play an important role, especially in onboarding women to the platforms. For example, we heard many reports of other people letting them work under their profiles for a while until they found their way around the platform, got the hang of it, and decided whether they wanted to continue in their own names. And perhaps this is why we had another very striking finding, which was that the gendered segmentation of the labor force online mirrors the gendered segmentation of the labor force offline. Now, overall, not many industries or sectors have been platformized, but of the ones we looked at, women were concentrated in those where they traditionally work in real life as well, specifically home cleaning and beauty, although they're also well represented in e-commerce, which is a sector that in some countries is actually dominated by women, at least in certain goods. But they're very rare in ride-hailing and delivery. So estimates are that depending on the country, they may be as few as 1 to 5% of the workforce in those platform sectors. Those with higher skills, though, do find quite a prevalent place on e-lancing platforms. Regardless of the sector, however, women's work on platforms tended to be more part-time than men's, which you can see in this chart, which shows the average number of hours put in on platforms per day by men or women. And you'll see that the skew for men is towards the higher part of the chart, so 7 or more hours worked a day, while the skew for women is towards the lower part of the chart, so 9 or less hours worked per day. It is interesting to note, however, that a similar proportion of men and women said they put in a pretty typical full-time day every day on platforms. And in fact, almost half of women said that they spent 7 hours or more on platforms each day. So quite long work days for half of our respondents. It's just that compared to men, it's not, it's relatively less, because over 2/3 of men said that they spent 7 or more hours on a platform each day. So again, very long work days, especially for men. And so as you would expect with this kind of a distribution, most women reported to us that their platform income was supplementary to their household income. And that's to some extent reflected in this chart, which talks about why people said that they did platform work. As you can see, women were more likely to be doing this work as a career than a stopgap compared to men, which may suggest a closer fit between the nature of the work that platforms offer, not full-time, flexible to some extent, and women's constraints or ambitions compared to men. In fact, many women told us that platform work is just one part of their overall economic portfolio. Some, like Archie on the left, who sells children's clothes from a store in Nairobi, are using platforms as one of many client acquisition channels, including walk-ins, word of mouth, and quasi-platforms or social networks like Facebook and WhatsApp. Others, like Mary on the right, who is a content writer in Nigeria, are still using platforms as their main client acquisition channel, but want to branch out in terms of the kinds of services that they offer. So what did we learn about the way that women are using financial services on platforms? First, the women in our survey reported much higher rates of adoption of deposit accounts since starting platform work than men did. Now, unfortunately, we weren't able to ascertain whether that was because they were less banked in the beginning, which may stand to reason, at least in some countries. However, it does seem that entering platform work has been an effective path to being banked for these women. But one of the starkest differences that emerged was actually in male versus female platform workers' access to capital. Whereas for men, the biggest barrier to earning more on platforms was just a lack of time, which you can see in the chart on the left, and which makes sense given how many hours we saw that many of them are working already. For women, the biggest barrier they reported to earning more on platforms was a lack of growth capital. Now, on the right, the chart potentially begins to help us see why, as more men reported having access to financial support for their platform work from friends and family than women did. In fact, the only two sources on this chart that you see that women accessed more than men were their spouse or the platforms themselves. And one reason for this could be that, as you might expect, many women said they'd have trouble going to a formal financial institution for capital, specifically citing lack of collateral or lack of business records as obstacles to obtaining a loan. When we come to insurance, it had low take-up overall among platform workers, which I think is reflective of larger market dynamics. But what was interesting was that 3 times more women reported accessing it since starting on platforms than men did. Across the surveyed countries, this was 14% of women as opposed to only 4% of men. And in India, 73% of women respondents said they would want life insurance compared to only about half of men. And 2/3 of women said that having accident or medical insurance would help them achieve their long-term goals, as opposed to only 1/3 of men. And in fact, many women said that having insurance could actually incentivize them to either get into platform work or get out, because regular jobs are more likely to offer this benefit. And this becomes important when you think about the business case for platforms to offer financial services to their workers, most of which right now rests on increasing worker engagement and retention, although a growing minority is turning to financial services as an independent revenue stream as well. Finally, we also saw more interest among women in other mechanisms that spoke to building long-term security. On the right, you see Mary, the content writer from our videos, who spoke in a particularly sophisticated way about how she makes sure that her earnings are building value for the long term. She said, "I prefer to keep my money in dollars rather than convert it. It might depreciate. They're Forex brokering organizations that take your money, trade the money for you, and pay you return on investment. I'm already an investor with one organization. I love them for their credibility. It's even better than putting your money in a savings account at the bank." Now, a lot of other women in our survey didn't speak quite so articulately about how their long-term financial strategies, but they were still disproportionately interested in translating their platform work income into long-term security for themselves and their families. So in India, 87% of women wanted financial planning support, while this didn't even register in the top 4 choices for men. And women also expressed an appetite for other kinds of non-financial assistance to help them grow their businesses, such as information on marketing. So where did all of this lead us in terms of what to do to improve the supply of high quality financial services for women on platforms? To a couple of early recommendations. First, customizing financial products and services to help women maximize the benefits of platform work for the long term. Like men, women platform workers need tools to smooth consumption, mitigate risks, and provide liquidity over the short term. However, more women than men looked at platform work as a long-term source of income. So long-term savings, credit to expand their businesses, and insurance products could all help them use platform income to build assets in alignment with this horizon. And to this end, investment loans that enable women to grow their income and savings products that allow them to accumulate resources for old age would be especially relevant for women platform workers. Take note of women's family obligations. Women in our study often link their financial aspirations back to security for their families. In addition to the savings products mentioned above, medical insurance that covers children and other family members could be particularly useful to women platform workers, since others' illnesses often directly affect their ability to work. Third, bundle financial products with non-financial services to amplify their effectiveness. Investment loans can't help female platform workers who can't provide the records to complete the application. But in addition to business advisory services, many women also wanted to understand how to plan for their individual financial futures. We would also think about tailoring financial services offerings to the needs of specific subsegments, because while this research has demonstrated the wide diversity of women's experiences with platforms, they vary tremendously based on factors such as sector, age and life stage, and local gender norms. So it's critical that ideas such as what we've discussed be adapted to the needs of specific subsegments of women platform workers. I think this is obvious, but always bears repeating. And then finally, we need to ensure that worker flexibility is built into these financial services and that they're designed to mitigate risks. Because to the extent that such product offerings can increase worker loyalty and engagement, they could also benefit platforms, which militates for their quantity and sustainability. But any products or services delivered to platform workers can't limit their ability to switch platforms and must account for the risk of sudden pay rate fluctuations, which have definitely been documented in many, many markets. Now, one other thing that I didn't put on here, but we've been thinking about a lot lately, is about women, where women get their information and support. There's a tendency to think that women get their information and resources more from informal than formal sources, but that's actually not what we found here. We didn't cover this, well, no, actually there was a slide on this during the presentation, but more women than men said they entered platform work with the help of information they found on the internet, as opposed to social networks, which were men's main source of information. As you also saw, fewer women received financial support from their social ties than men did, but more women availed themselves of support from the platforms. So this is maybe less a recommendation than a restatement of the fact that there is a gap and a niche for formal FSPs and platforms to fill in terms of providing financial services that women need on platforms, and one we hope that more of them will address through gender responsive analysis and products. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Tarun.
Thank you, Rani, for that informative presentation. So now I want to encourage our audience to post your questions in the chat as we now discuss more on what has been presented here, some interesting trends and interesting facts about women that necessarily wouldn't have picked up. For example, I think it's quite interesting that you're saying the source of information is coming from the internet as compared to men who are getting from social platforms, or that men actually get more of informal loans or financial support from their networks more than women. I would have expected actually that women are the ones who are getting that support from that informal section coming up in your survey, but it's interesting to note that. But Rani, Thank you so much for this information. And I think it's really interesting to look at the examples which are available in the links of a full report of your survey or your research. That is the YouTube videos for actual women that you interviewed, like Mary from Nigeria and Archie from Kenya. I wanted to ask, in terms of the impact of COVID-19 and how women have been participating in platforms or even informal platforms since then. Now we know that the rise of digital use or the use of digital platform it really increased during COVID or post-COVID. But has there been any change since then? You know, now that we a little bit far from the 2020 situation or scenario, have people stopped using platforms and maybe sought out more traditional or formal ways of earning income, or really they've found this as a primary source of income that can affect their livelihoods and they're still really thriving on the platforms?
Before I answer that, shall I unshare my screen or is it fine to leave like this?
I think we can unshare or, yeah, and discuss.
So that's a really good question. It is like famously difficult to get current data on actual platform workers. And so some of the survey that you mentioned that Senfree had done, I think it was in 2019 at this point, it remains actually one of the last sort of large scale estimations of the extent of platform work in emerging markets in terms of worker participation. But what I can say is that we actually saw a little bit of a thinning of the ranks in the beginning part of the pandemic in terms of platforms, especially those in sectors, as you would expect, that relied on work that was done in place, in location-based work, often face-to-face, so home repair, home cleaning, things like that. Since then, there were many sort of platform failures. Since then, the number of platforms had stabilized and now is undergoing yet another thinning due to the sort of adverse macroeconomic situation and the drying up of venture capital that has, you know, sustained these business models for many years. So if we take that as a proxy, I mean, I think it's safe to assume that there has probably been some worker exit from platform models, but the larger established platforms continue to thrive in their markets. What'll be interesting, I think, to see is the extent to which they are really forced to compete for the same pools of workers. I think that's one thing that may begin to differentiate markets over time, because it is absolutely commonplace for workers to toggle between different platforms in the same sector, whether you're talking about, you know, Bolt or Glovo in ride hailing, or you know, Urban Company and some of its smaller rivals in India in, you know, home services and beauty. In high unemployment markets, that labor pool is still not close to being tapped out. But in markets where the labor supply is more limited, you are definitely seeing competition for workers, and that's actually one of the things that improves the business case for financial services as a value added to retain the worker base.
And just to get closer to the persona of women that are participating on platforms. Now, you spoke about Mary from Nigeria, and she seemed to have such a sophisticated way of, you know, participating on the platform and managing her financial life, you know, converting it into dollars and trading on markets. Now, that sounds to me like a very sophisticated trader or woman. Now, in our markets, in our different markets, even in the countries that you've talking about, that you did this survey on, there are different levels of women who are excluded or who are marginalized. We know that, first of all, you have to have some kind of a digital account for you to even participate, right? And you have to have access to the devices. And we know all the gaps that are that become barriers for women. Can you speak about those who are thriving, the kind of persona they have in the different markets?
Sure. We did a little bit of persona development based on the results of this survey. And I have to say that what came out was not so much country-based differences, but socioeconomic differences were honestly in levels of privilege that were quite common across countries and correlated closely to the sectors of work that people entered platforms in, whether they were men or women, to be honest. So at the higher levels of education, you found people going into e-lancing. And there's a very good representation of women in these sectors. They're not necessarily all very wealthy women by any means. I mean, Mary's a school teacher. But they do, what distinguishes them is their level of skills and education. As you go down the socioeconomic ladder, you start, getting into platform verticals with less skilled forms of work. So the way at the other end, ride hailing and delivery, which, still does require a driver's license, either for a car or a motorcycle. So it's not completely unskilled in that sense. But that tends to be a catch-all sector for men who don't have advanced qualifications. For women, this is where the sort of gender division of labor really seems to take place. For women, that segment would be home cleaning. And then there are segments in the middle, such as e-commerce and beauty, which require sort of a middle level of skills. But this is all among women and men who are included in platforms, right? The far bigger universe is, of course, those who are excluded. And what we found, I think, was partially a result of that Semfree study, was by far the biggest gating factor to platform work is digital infrastructure and connectivity and rurality or urbanity, which is highly correlated to those things. So I think that the upper bound is always going to be set by those parameters. Then within that, which sector of platform work you go into will not only be determined it'll be determined both by your gender, but also your skill or socioeconomic level.
Thank you, Rani. And just to clarify what you mean by e-lancing, just for our audience to really understand the kind of woman that's e-lancing and you study.
Yeah, sorry. So in e-lancing, it's a kind of a bigger bucket that contains lots of different kinds of work. It can be either remotely performable work, such as hashtagging or location tagging, or it can be work that is performed remotely but there's a physical product. So, photographers, website design, content creators, and then there's also sort of people who sell their services to be performed on location, but use the platforms as a client acquisition channel. So I'm thinking about lots of artists do this, actually, DJs, visual artists, even tailors and seamstresses. That is largely what we put in the e-lancing bucket, but it tends to be a more skilled, professional, digitally savvy type of person, both men and women.
Okay, and then you spoke a bit about unskilled participation of women who are unskilled and those who might be providing cleaning services on different platforms. Now I'm looking at this subgroup of women, and possibly they're the ones who are being introduced to the form of inclusive financial economic system in their markets, really, and we want them to participate more and hopefully have their lives improve, their businesses expand, some kind of growth, which will add up to the growth of the overall economy, right? I'm wondering if this has really, their participation on platforms, right, when they're providing this sort of gendered labor-related way on platforms, right? Are their lives improving? Is this becoming a primary source of income? Are they now using it to get the insurance, like the product that you're talking about? You said a lot of women are interested in insurance products or are asking for savings products. Is this really becoming something that their lives, or your research, does it point to their lives improving, or maybe financial inclusion increasing?
Oh, you're asking a very big question, a very long-term question, which our research definitely did not have the scope to track sort of longer-term changes in business growth or sort of perceived economic impact on these women's lives. What I can say, I think, is that let's take the example of a home cleaner. First of all, home cleaning, the platformization of home cleaning has actually not become as firmly entrenched as it has in other sectors such as ride hailing. And our hypothesis around this is around really the level of personal confidence you need in that service provider. So there's a certain level of risk into getting into the car of somebody you don't know. But there's a much higher level of risk involved in letting somebody you don't know into your house for several hours to clean it. And so platforms have had much less impact in disrupting that sector, which, in many countries is dominated by informal social networks that source this labor for the households that can afford it. It's had much less impact, much less penetration, and has disrupted those social forms of labor procurement than it has in ride hailing. So, impact that way on home cleaning, I think the jury is still very much out. Where we have seen, I think, more stories of growth is in the e-commerce sector. Many women did tell us that platforms, whether formal platforms or social networks like Facebook and WhatsApp, have really allowed them to access new markets. And there's the two groups that are using formal e-commerce platforms versus like informal social commerce are somewhat distinct, but definitely overlapping. I mean, we find that even those who use formal e-commerce platforms, like, whether it's Jumia or Amazon or Gigi or Sky Garden or whatever, Shopee in Indonesia, most of them are also promoting themselves on social media, but not, it's hardly everyone who's using social media is also doing the same. So the informal social commerce has much lower barriers to entry than marketing your goods on a formal e-commerce platform, and therefore is open to a much wider range of people, especially women who may lack the capital and the formal registration of their businesses needed to participate in a formal e-commerce platform.
Thank you, Annie. And when we're talking mainly in women's financial inclusion, there's social norms, such a big thing, and that impacts how women participate in products, even in the product design. You really need to understand the context, the stage of life a woman is, and tailor that so that that product is actually relevant, so that it actually makes sense to me and I can use it. Now, I think the social norms, according to your research, or maybe you can tell us more about how that has also kind of translated on the platforms as well, that it's impacting how you participate in the type of job that you do, in maybe the risk factors, or even the kind of activity, to what extent you can actually make money on the platform because of the social constraints that women have. What did your research come up with regarding social norms and platforms?
Yeah, so I think, two very obvious places where you can see the impact of social norms that we covered in the research is, one, that gender and labor segmentation of, how gender determines which sectors you even go into. And two, I think you also see it in the kinds of things that women express with regard to what they want from financial services. So this real connection of their aspirations, their immediate aspirations for their platform income, to their long-term aspirations for security for their family. I think that, the gendered implications of that are somewhat obvious. What was a bit surprising to us was the places where we saw that platforms had helped certain women also kind of circumvent limiting gender norms. So a couple of examples of this. Some of the home cleaners that we spoke to especially talked about how when they got jobs off the platform, they had very little bargaining power with respect to how much they were going to be paid. Often, in fact, I'm thinking of in South Africa, we were told stories of how people they show up at a home, they clean it, and then they literally take whatever is given to them. Whereas when you go through a platform, it's not like that at all. You have a fixed rate for a fixed number of hours of work. And if the client wants to increase that, an additional charge is added. And so the client is not bargaining with the worker, the client is bargaining with a large institution with resources to leverage in any kind of a dispute. And so that we heard from women has helped them in terms of their bargaining power vis-a-vis the people that they work for. And that, I think, it's not exclusively gendered. And, I think workers of different socioeconomic levels and especially in societies, with strong social distinctions, whatever they are, can suffer from a real lack of bargaining power. But in this case, we heard that going on platform can help with that, these women with that. There were also other kinds of examples that were given. So, we heard a lot about how what we're calling the depersonalization, the anonymization of how you procure work helped women circumvent some of those barriers. And that could be, for example, we were speaking with a platform in Kenya that helps construction workers find jobs. Now, again, in the informal, normal way in which these jobs are obtained and distributed, that goes through social ties. Social networks tend to be gendered. And so, there are actually female construction workers out there, but they tend to have a little bit of a harder time finding these jobs because of the nature of their social networks. And what we heard is that going on the platform helped them find more work because it doesn't say if you're a man or a woman. Similarly, we heard a story in Indonesia in particular where there was a swimming instructor who found that once she went on a platform and people weren't judging her by her appearance, she called herself overweight. She was able to get a lot more work because people couldn't immediately apply those gendered standards of appearance and impute some kind of sort of, conclusions about her work performance by the way she looked. So there are interesting sort of cracks, it seems, that platforms may be able to pry a little wider open in this edifice of gendered social norms that women face.
Thank you. It's interesting to see those sort of advantages of really marketing yourself on a platform then when you are marketing a traditional way, the advantages of that and how you have more opportunities on a platform than maybe in the traditional way. But just something related to that, work-life balance. If you are really active on platforms and you are marketing yourself and you have to respond to requests or queries, and as a woman, the other unpaid for or where your time goes to if you're a mother or if you have other responsibilities that your social context requires you to do. What did your research find out about how women are managing this?
Yeah, such good questions.
Any difference between men and women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, such good questions. So I think there's been a lot of hype about how platforms are going to, help women work part-time on a flexible basis and manage their caregiving responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. And we found that to be partially true. The problem is, certainly as you saw in terms of on the slide that showed the distribution of hours that women are working on platforms compared to men, they are working more part-time. And we did hear from women that does help them manage their household responsibilities, their caregiving responsibilities. The problem tends to occur with platforms that have minimums for a certain number of hours you need to work per week, or time periods that you must be available, or penalties for rejecting jobs that don't fit either your timing or the distance that you're willing to travel, et cetera, et cetera. Now, men, also the thing is that men also expressed appreciation for that same aspect. We heard many men actually say, you know, part of the thing I like about platform work is that if I have an emergency in my village and I need to go out of town, I can do that. I don't need to explain myself to a boss. I can just shut the app off and go. So they also appreciate similar advantages and suffer from similar disadvantages. I mean, I think that we can say that that effect is intensified for women. But what was interesting about the conversations that we had is that it's not as starkly gendered as you might think.
Thank you, Rani. And I see that we haven't had much interaction or questions from our audience. I'm thinking that maybe they're finding our conversation very, very interesting, because I sure am. But just maybe to ask you a final question. And just before you give us your final remarks, or something that you would want us to take with us from the work that you have done, maybe before that, I can ask about the differences. And I know that your main focus has been on platforms and not necessarily social networks, but what trends do you see with women on the platforms, and then on what we're doing in informal social networks on Facebook and WhatsApp? I would imagine that for the marginalized women, most of the activity would be on WhatsApp. It's the easiest. Maybe you can comment to that, or what could point to some differences from the research that you conducted.
Yeah. There's no way to quantify this, unfortunately, right now, but absolutely based on the qualitative work that we've done, the barriers to entry for informal social commerce are much, much lower. There, you're essentially monetizing your network. You may not even really need to have stock if you can on-sell for other vendors, kind of in like a drop ship model. Many people are already adept at using social media. So those entry-level skills are often there already. Whereas, you know, to register on a formal e-commerce platform, you have to be a formal business. You have to be registered, and you have to have certain evidence of that status. Many formal e-commerce platforms also make you spend certain amounts of money to sponsor ads for yourself. And several entrepreneurs that we spoke with said, you know, I actually just don't think that that's a great use of my capital. I'd rather sponsor my own ads, let's say on Facebook. That brings me more return. I mean, I think, you know, when we think about informal social commerce, what really stands out is that it's such a bottom-up approach. It's really like a grassroots solution, bootstrapped together, cobbled together from many different types of platforms and mechanisms, you know, from the social media services for client acquisition and discovery, to the different kinds of payment options that you may have available to you in your country or your context, to the different delivery options you may have available to you, everything from, you know, I'm going to drive this package over to the client's house, to formal delivery services who will pick up and deliver for you, and even handle certain other aspects of the transaction. It's cobbled together. E-commerce, on the other hand, you know, the value that it offers is that end-to-end solution that takes care of all of the different stages in that client transaction process. And you pay for that. You pay a cut off the top. So I would say that, you know, when we're sort of conceptualizing it, you know, you think bootstrap solution over here, sort of the Cadillac end-to-end model over here. Generally, they're much lower barriers to entry in the informal social commerce, except for one thing, I would say, and that really is the digital skills. Because the fact that you can cobble together all these different things means that you have to cobble together all these different things. And, you know, we talked to entrepreneurs who were juggling 5 different social media platforms just for client acquisition and discovery, which takes time, which takes effort, and which also takes savvy. And you might imagine that some of that is taken care of if you're able to reach the kind of level of stability where you can register on a formal e-commerce platform. So those are some of the differences and similarities that we have seen. I will stress also, and this is actually something I wanted to say in conclusion, that those boundaries are blurring. This is such a fluid space right now that new models are coming up all the time that straddle the middle of those two universes somehow. So I'm thinking of an organization in India that started out supplying stock, virtual stock actually, to social media, or to informal online commerce entrepreneurs. They never had to buy the stock. You know, the stock was drop shipped from the supplier. That model has now transitioned to not paying the sort of last mile sellers a commission, but treating them as influencers. So, you know, that model was there for, I don't know, a couple of years, and it's already gone. And that's how fast we're seeing the evolution of business models in this space. So it's still fluid, it's still nascent. And, you know, I think that there's going to be a lot of innovation in it going forward. The thing that we're going to be watching is two things. How well can all this data that's being generated be leveraged to provide better financial services to workers? And what does that mean for these workers being able to access stable incomes and, you know, the quality of the work that is able to be procured through these mechanisms?
Thank you, Rani, for this presentation. Such an interesting topic, especially for the inclusive finance professionals that may be in the audience who want to serve this market, who wants to explore where else they can launch products that can add to financial inclusion and the well-being of women who were previously underserved or still marginalized, as we all work towards reducing that gender gap in all its different forms. Now, I know that I have learned a lot and I still want to learn more. So I hope that there's going to be more research in this area. We're going to really watch the evolution, the trends, and the different kinds of women who are participating on the platforms, whether they're skilled or unskilled, and how their financial lives improve. And maybe all of us are going to end up being gig workers or participating on platforms more and have our lives be affected by where we are going in the future as we move towards a more digitized economy, and make sure that we don't leave women behind or other vulnerable groups behind as we become a more digitized society. So thank you very much. Such an interesting subject matter, and I hope that we can all learn and become more interested in such advancements of e-commerce and how it affects our financial lives. Without adding more to the conversation, I hope that we all got the links to the CGAP research, but just to remind you that you will get an email with the recording of this session, so you can go over the same resource and try and hear more about what Rani is talking about and what she has presented, and also check out the resources on the CGAP website to get more information. So thank you very much to all our participants. I'm wishing you a very happy Friday and a great weekend. Thank you to Rani for your time. We really appreciate this. Hopefully we can have more conversation about more of the research and the blogs and the resources that CGAP is preparing for us on the same topic. Thank you so much, Rani.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
So bye, everyone.